Fractiv is a hybrid granular effect and sampler. You can load in samples or you can record directly into Fractiv, which means that it's a sampler that can actually sample, which I haven't seen a lot of in plugin samplers. To me, it's the Swiss Army knife plugin. It has so many different features that will enhance your workflow and speed up your workflow as well, because there's so much you can do within one plugin. It's pretty awesome. This video will look at using Fractiv with Pro Tools, so let's get into it. Fractiv is based around using samples, so getting them into Fractiv is extremely important. I'll show you a few ways that you can do this so that you have all of the options available to you. One way that you can get your samples into Fractiv is to drag the audio file in from either a folder or if you're using a sample service like Splice. And it's pretty simple. You just get your folder, go to the location of where your sample is, and then literally just click and hold and drag it across over to Fractiv, and you've got the sample in the window and it's ready to use. Another option is to load in a sample from within Fractiv directly. If you just go to this folder button here and then click it, it will bring up an Explorer window and you can go to the location of your sample and then load it in like that. So if I just choose a different sample here, and you can see we've got a new sample in here, and that's another way that you can do it. The final way of getting audio into Fractiv is to sample audio into Fractiv itself. This is a great option, especially if you've got audio in the project that you've recorded or processed and you want it to be sampled exactly how it is. You can just sample it directly into Fractiv and you can work on it from there. It saves you bouncing out that specific piece of audio and then dragging it into Fractiv again. It's all within one project, which is nice. Plus, you can do live automation on the sample going into Fractiv if you want, so you can change certain parameters as it's going in and get a specific sound for the sample. So it really just gives you a lot more options. Now, this can be done in two different ways. The first way is quicker and easier, but I prefer the second option, and I'll show you why. So I've got some audio here that I want to put into Fractiv, and the first way that we're going to do it is to add Fractiv at the end of the processing chain. So as you can see on the track, I've already got an EQ and I've got a compressor on there, and I want the processed audio to go into Fractiv. So I'm going to put Fractiv at the end of the chain. You just go to Instrument and then Fractiv, and it's important that it goes at the end of the chain, because if it was at the start, the EQ and compression wouldn't be affecting what's going into Fractiv. It's only what's before, so keep that in mind. And now all you have to do is press play and it's going to appear in the sample window. Then we can press freeze to keep it there. And there we go. Now, the reason that I don't like to use this option that much is because it puts everything on one track. You've got your processing and then you've got Fractiv, and it's just going to get really messy, especially when we get to re-recording the output of Fractiv later on. So for me, I prefer to keep Fractiv on a separate track and treat it as its own thing rather than mashing it all into one track. It's pretty simple to do. It's a little bit more involved than the first option, but I think it's worth it. And once you've done it a few times, it's really just as quick. So I'm just going to get rid of Fractiv on the track with the sample that we want to put into Fractiv. And you can see here, I've got an empty audio track, and this has an instance of Fractiv on it as well. So most of this happens in the mix window. So let's just expand that. And I want to send audio from this track to this track, but it's not as simple as just setting the output to that track. You can't do that. So what we do instead is use auxiliary or bus tracks. So let's create a new bus track. Just press Control or Command if you're on Mac, Shift N, and then create a stereo track. If the sample that you have is on a stereo track, then keep everything stereo. So keep the audio track with Fractiv on it in stereo and keep the auxiliary track in stereo. If it's in mono, then keep everything in mono. It doesn't matter either way, but make sure you're consistent. And then here we're going to select aux input, and I'll just name this Fractiv routing. So we have our aux track here, and we want to send audio from the track with the audio on it already to the Fractiv routing aux input. And this is pretty simple. If you go to the I/O section of your track, or the ins and outs of your track, the top option is for the inputs. The bottom option is for the outputs. So we don't care about the input. We want to send the output of this to the auxiliary track. So let's just click on this. And then if we go to track, Fractiv routing, click on that. and now it's going to Fractiv routing. And what's interesting is you'll notice it's now added it to the bus option. So it automatically creates a bus for you. So now if I press play, it's going to show on the audio track and it's going to show on the Fractiv routing track. Perfect. So now we need to send the audio from the Fractiv routing track into the audio track with Fractiv on it. And to do this, we need to look at the inputs. So let's go to the I/O section again and then choose bus, Fractiv routing. And if you look at this, there's no track option like for the output. So that's why it's useful that Pro Tools automatically sets up a bus for the aux track when you send something to it. So now if I press the record button and the monitoring button, but I'm going to turn this down because it's going to double in volume now. And if I press play, it will show on there as well. Great. So if I then go into Fractiv, I get rid of this freeze and I press play again, it's going to appear in here. Then I can press freeze and stop Pro Tools and we have the sample ready to go. Brilliant. So we now have the sample in Fractiv and we've got it on a separate track. So it's its own thing. We can treat it however we want to without having to worry about what's on the track already. Once you've got a sound that you're happy with in Fractiv, you can then re-record the output of Fractiv onto another audio track. So let's see how we do that. So I've just got this instance of Fractiv and I'm using the same sample as before, but I've just done some processing to it and you can see it's going a bit crazy. So I'll just quickly press play so you can hear it. It's quite a liquidy and scratchy sort of effect. And what I'm doing with this is using the first modulation at almost 100%. And that's controlling pad X, pad Y, and the filter frequency. I've got a low pass filter going on. I've cranked the resonance up so we get that frequency sweep quite nicely. And that's what's creating that liquidy sound. I'm using the random wave because I just really enjoy how it creates these unpredictable sounds, and it's a really good tool for creativity, in my opinion. I have the rate going at 17 Hertz. And if you see up here, there's also a little indicator that something else is affecting it, which we'll look at in a second. I'm using the sliders underneath pad X and pad Y to fine tune how much of this modulation is going to each. And if you're not aware, pad X and pad Y refer to the X and Y box here. So X is the start point of the sample and Y is the length of the sample. And that's why this little selection is constantly moving, because I'm controlling that. And then for modulation B, 100% depth, and this is affecting the LFO rate of the first modulation, so that's why we have this changing above. I'm using the ramp up wave and I've got it just before 50% of the depth on the fine tuning slider here. And then for modulation C, we have around 65% on the depth. I'm using a sine wave and the rate is 6 Hertz, and I'm controlling the pitch, formant, varispeed, and decimate, which decimate is on the slice section of this, and it's a really gnarly bit crusher. It's really cool. And then obviously fine tuning them using the sliders, and I've set the midpoints on each parameter so I can control how far it goes either way a bit more. And also I've changed the envelope. I've got the attack as high as it will go because every time the sample moves it can get a bit clicky, which is a cool effect, but in this case I was going for a more liquidy sound, so I wanted a really high attack for that. And I've lowered the sustain a little bit, and then the release is also tailing it off so it's a bit smoother. And finally I've set the direction to ping pong, so you have 3 different directions here: forward, reverse, and ping pong, and you can use it as a loop or a one shot. I'm using it as a loop, and the ping pong just means that it's going from one end of the sample to the other and it keeps going back and forth rather than just from the start to the end, from the start to the end, or the other way around. So now you've seen that, and I want to record this onto another track. So I'm just going to get rid of this track, which has the sample on it that we sampled into Fractiv before, because we don't need it anymore. We've already done that. And I'll just rename this track to Fractiv just to make things nice and clean. And the way to record the output of Fractiv to another track is very similar to how we sampled into Fractiv using the auxiliary track. So what I'm going to do first is have another audio track, make that stereo so that everything's consistent, and I'll just call this Fractiv output. You can guess this is where the audio is going to be recorded to. And we already have our aux track here called Fractiv routing, and I'm going to use that again, but in case you skipped over the second option when it came to sampling into Fractiv, you just press Control or Command Shift N, and then it brings up this new tracks option. Choose stereo, choose aux input, and then name it whatever you want. but we've already got it here, so I'm just going to keep this here. So if we look at the first audio track, which is the track with Fractiv on it, in the I/O section of this track, the input is set as Fractiv routing from before, but for this, we're outputting audio, so we don't want the input to be Fractiv routing. We want the output to be Fractiv routing. It's just at the bottom here in the bus section. So now, if I go to Fractiv and press play, it's going to show in the Fractiv routing. Awesome. So next, we need to send the audio from Fractiv routing to the Fractiv output, and that's simple as well. We just go to the input section of the audio track which we're going to record onto, and then go to bus, Fractiv routing. And now if we press record and press the I button, I'm going to turn this down because once again it's going to double in volume, and then we press the play button in Fractiv. It's all there, which is great. You don't actually need to have the monitoring on when you're recording. It will still record without it, but you need to keep the record enable button on. So I'm just going to bring this back to 0 roughly, and then I'm just going to show more of the arrangement window here because we're going to need to see both. So now if I press record and then play, and then I open up Fractiv and I press play, we now have the output from Fractiv in this track and we can hear it. And it's an empty track, no processing on it. And this is the simplest way to go about doing this, but you can also get more creative with this. If we go back into Fractiv, I'll just delete this clip here and say that I want to control the decimate option, but not with a modulator. I want to control it as it's being recorded out. Well, we can do that too. So if we just get rid of the decimate option, and now if I press record and then I press play on Fractiv, I can adjust the decimate parameter as it's being recorded out so I can get it even more specific to what I want. Great, and now that is recorded onto another track. And you can do more than that as well. You can add processing after Fractiv so that the output is affected by that as well. You don't put it before Fractiv because there's nothing actually on the audio track. All of the sound is coming from within Fractiv, so anything before isn't actually going to do anything. You want to make sure that all of the processing is afterwards. So the great thing about Fractiv isn't just about what's in Fractiv, it's how you get audio into it and how you get audio out of it. The whole process is really creative. And I just really love how the whole time that you use in Fractiv from start to finish, you've got so many options to explore and it really steps up your audio workflow. The final thing that I'll show you in Fractiv is how to use it as a VST instrument. Fractiv comes as both an audio effect and a VST instrument, which is really cool. And using it as a VST instrument means that you can do a little bit more with it. You can use your MIDI keyboard to play the notes in. And this is really good for sound design if you want to use a keyboard to control the pitch rather than using a knob on the screen. And it's also really cool for creating your own synths, which I love to do in Fractiv. To do this, first we need to create an instrument track. So press Control-Shift-N or Command-Shift-N if you're on Mac, and then choose Stereo, Instrument Track, and then I'll just name this Fractiv Inst. And I'll just move this over here and I'll add an instance of Fractiv to this. Fractiv is in the same location regardless of if it's an audio effect or a VST instrument. For Pro Tools, they just put it in the same section, which is instrument. So select Fractiv. Here we go. And if I press record on Fractiv and I get my MIDI keyboard up, then I can press the notes here. And as you can see on the screen, it's following along in the keyboard in Fractiv. So everything's working. That's great. So I've just loaded up a sample into Fractiv, and this is a bass one shot, which sounds like this. Now, if I press some notes on my MIDI keyboard, it's playing according to the notes. And this particular one-shot sample is a C note. However, if you have a one-shot which is a different note, you can always use the pitch knob here to make it so that it is C, and then it makes more sense on the keyboard rather than having to figure out the transposition in your brain, which is just unnecessary frustration. So now with that same bass sample, I've added some processing, I've added some modulation to the formants, I've added a low pass filter, and then I'm modulating that as well. And then I'm also modulating the decimate option quite slowly. Plus I've increased the attack on the envelope. So this is what we have now. If I play the notes, it still works with the same notes. It's just going to be the affected sound now. So you can really design your own synths using Fractiv, which is really cool. There's a lot of synths out there, so it's easy to end up using something that sounds the same as everyone else. With this, you can get something really creative and really unique. And I've even found it's a good songwriting tool. I'll make a sound and then base a whole song around it. So it's really fun to play about with this option, and it's just great that Fractiv comes as both an audio effect and as a VST instrument.